Begin Self-Publishing episode number 48. Writing, business or hobby?
Interested in self-publishing but don't know where to start? Want to get your book onto Amazon? Want to hold your paperback book in your hands? Learn how on the Begin Self-Publishing podcast with your host, Tim Lewis.
I think there is a time in every self-publisher's path they have to decide whether they're self-publishing as a hobby or as a business. Are you just writing for pleasure with the hope of a little bit of cash on the side, or are you writing as part of a business, as a money-making exercise? Now, you'll hear a lot of people saying that you should always consider self-publishing as a business. I'm not sure I'd actually necessarily always agree with this. For while there are obviously parts of the self-publishing journey that you do need to consider in a business-like fashion, if you go fully down the business route, then it can be quite expensive if you don't succeed. However, I think ultimately each self-publisher will have to end up going down the business mindset route rather than being a hobbyist if they have any kind of prolonged success. So let's examine the two kinds of mindsets that you can have as a self-publisher. As with all things, it's not necessarily the case that people fall into either one category or the other. For example, I'm kind of a mix between the two. So even though I have a business for my writing efforts, I generally have tended to treat it more as a hobbyist thing rather than actually as a proper business. So the hobbyist mindset is based upon spending as little as possible on every cost for your self-publishing efforts. So you barter, you economise, and you spend your own time learning how to do things like formatting, creating covers, and self-editing. While quality will probably suffer if you do, say, for example, create your own cover or just do self-editing, there is obviously a lot to be said for this in terms of not wasting money if you're not successful. Though if you take this approach too far, then obviously that will affect your chances of success as well. Hobbyists tries to do everything themselves because for them, cost is all about money and it's not about time. Hobbyists also tends to use free tools rather than pay for tools, even fairly cheap tools, relatively, like Scrivener. So they'll find the cheap free version. And there is a lot to be said for spending the time to see if you can find cheaper alternatives to online and other tools. That said, if your entire time is spent trying to find a cheap writing program, when you could be saving yourself time paying a little bit for an extra tool, this may be a false economy. They don't create a company, everything runs through the bank account of the hobbyist. So it's very hard to actually separate out what's income from the books and what's income from elsewhere. Hobbyists generally don't like to use paid advertising, as they feel that they won't get any return from it. Hobbyists tend to, and this is a little bit of a stereotype, they tend to be much more interested in the writing side of things than in the actual marketing skills. So they tend to go to lots of writing conferences, but they won't go to any marketing conferences or spend any time or money learning anything about marketing or any of the other elements of self-publishing. Most of the time, hobbyists assume that their income will be coming from somewhere else apart from their books, at least initially. The business mindset, on the other hand, is quite happy to spend money if it feels like an investment. So if you're spending money on, say, a tool, and that's going to cut down your time, then the business mindset says that you spend that money. So it's not so much about minimising your outset in terms of monetary spend, but on how much return you reckon that expenditure will get you. This doesn't mean that people with the business mindset will waste money willy-nilly on things, but they are much more likely to spend money on tooling, paid advertising and things that hobbyists would never spend money on. People with a business mindset have no problem with hiring outside help, such as virtual assistants, to help them with their daily duties, or paying people for covers, editing, and things which they will hopefully give them much more time to concentrate on what they're good at, which for the best writers is obviously writing. They set up a company with its own bank account as a totally separate entity to their own financial affairs. They pay for any tools that they might need, such as Scrivener. As discussed, they are willing to pay money on things like paid advertising and marketing if they can see that's going to create a return for their books. They tend to concentrate much more on the non-writing side of things in terms of conferences. Though of course they probably will still go to things like writing conferences, just not entirely ignoring every other aspect of business. The business mindset assumes that eventually income will come from the business itself. It doesn't necessarily stop them from having a day job. It just means that they are assuming that in the medium term, this business will create an income in itself. The business mindset in this effect is a bet on success. But obviously it's much more costly in terms of your financial outlay if the business does not succeed in self-publishing. Now each of these mindsets has its own advantage. The main advantage of the hobbyist mindset is that the cost of failure is extremely low. Setting up a business is not cheap, and neither is the cost of keeping one going. The main disadvantage to having a hobbyist mindset is that you tend to miss out on opportunities for your book to actually succeed, because you're not spending money on advertising or other efforts. The quality of your book is not as good as it could be. It's also very easy to fall into this just write another book syndrome, hoping that each book will be a success. And eventually you probably will have success if you carry on a hobbyist and you just keep writing. But there does tend to be a lack of analysis of why their current books aren't selling. The main advantage to the business mindset is that if you are successful, then you're in a much better position to scale your efforts, hiring in help so that you can concentrate on what you were good at. It's also a lot better in most countries from a tax perspective, because you can write off many more costs if you're a business than if you're just an individual with a hobbyist mindset. You don't have to take all of your income out at one stage either. So if you have 1 year with a massive hit in your book, you're not forced to pay income tax on that in the year that you make the revenue. You can spread it out over a few years and pay less income tax. Biggest problem really with the business mindset is that if you don't make any profits for several years in a row, then it's much, much more costly. You're making a bet on success with the business mindset. Now obviously, if you keep hammering away and you keep listening to the right podcasts or reading the right books, and you gradually learn and you start changing things, and you get better at writing books, I think ultimately most people will probably succeed with a business mindset. But that could be years down the line. You could have run out of money by then. So you'll hear a lot of people say that you should be professional as a self-publisher and spend all your money on professional editing, on professional covers. And I think that the way that the self-publishing market is changing is that you are being more and more forced to have a much more business mindset in terms of what you are prepared to spend on your book. But on the other hand, you could start with smaller books with a more hobbyist mindset and then switch across to the business mindset once you've had a small amount of success. I don't think you necessarily need to start with your first ever book to write a 150,000 word book with a professional editor and professional cover and spend thousands and thousands and pounds on marketing it. It might be better to start with a very small novella or short non-fiction book. Maybe pay for just proofreading, editing, and a fairly cheap pre-made cover. And that might be a better situation to start with than going full in setting up your own independent business in the first instance. I haven't fully moved into the business mindset, despite the fact that I actually have a business. So I'm kind of in the worst of both worlds myself. So for example, in my business, I've been toying with the idea of getting virtual assistants, people to help me. Because even though I know how to do a lot of things, I seem to be just spreading my time really thinly on everything and never getting anything done. I'm very rarely actually releasing fiction books. I never get round to doing the training and other things I'll say I'll do on the back of this podcast. I've got various app ideas and other things that are nothing to do with self-publishing that I want to explore. Though it's very hard to get out of the hobbyist mindset with these things. It's very easy to say, well, I've got enough income coming in from other sources to pay for the few bits and pieces here and there. I can't afford a virtual assistant, or I can't afford to go to a co-working space or something along those lines. But ultimately, we're all faced with this choice of moving from the hobbyist to the business mindset if we want to be serious about self-publishing. That said, I wouldn't necessarily advise anybody to do what I did and to go straight into setting up a business for their writing. If you've got other things that you want to do in the online business world, then it makes a lot more sense. And if you happen already to have a business of some kind, then that makes even more sense to run your self-publishing efforts through the business. Ultimately, it's a balance between how much money you're prepared to spend on self-publishing, how much you can face the risk if it doesn't succeed. In some ways, I think you're better off to start with maybe a slightly smaller, lower cost project to begin with, to learn the ropes, and then for your later project, maybe go full in with a totally business mindset approach with the best possible cover you can get, the best editing you can get. Spend time to build up, say, either via content marketing or social media marketing, or even just by building a community from your previous books, so that you can actually leverage that existing community together with a professional business mindset and actually make a success of it. But to say that everybody has to automatically start off with the full-on business mindset might be a bit optimistic, at least for people who haven't got that much money to start with. Hopefully this has given you some pause for thought. As you can see, I'm in the process myself of trying to make this transition between the two, from rather being a sort of semi-hobbyist business to actually being a proper business that makes money and spends money. Because you really do have to think of things as an investment eventually. Before I go today, I've got a slight favour to ask you guys. I put myself forward as a potential nomination for the UK Podcast Awards for Best UK Podcast. Now, while I'm not necessarily expecting to win the award, because there are much bigger podcasts that are being nominated, I'd quite like to at least get into the last nominations of the award, because I'm going to the award ceremony in June. If you want to help me, please go to the Begin Self-Publishing Podcast Facebook page, and you'll see that my pinned post is a link towards the New Media Europe vote for the UK Podcast Award. If you could go on there and vote for the Begin Self-Publishing show, that would be appreciated. Thanks a lot, guys. Talk to you guys next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please stop by iTunes and rate and leave a review. This helps make the show more visible. For free resources, show notes, and other helpful content, join the community at beginselfpublishing.com.